Picture this. You mouth off to the wrong official or steal the wrong loaf of bread, and boom, your life gets turned into a public lesson. Not just justice served, but justice staged. The British Empire didn't just punish, it produced a show. 9-tailed whips on a ship's deck, the hush of a crowd under a gallows, a volley of rifles on parade ground gravel, iron frames locking a body into silence. Is that law or theater built from fear? Stick with me. The deeper we go, the more you'll see the law wasn't only ink on parchment, it was signatures carved into skin. Let's anchor the timeline so your brain isn't juggling centuries like bowling pins. First, the Tudor vibe kings, courtiers, and cruel gadgets. Then the long 1700s into the 1800s, bloody code, capital punishment galore, and a whole culture of public executions. Then the 19th century reforms start reeling things back slowly. And by the early 20th century, the army has its own grim playbook in the trenches. Meanwhile, the empire's tentacles wrap this logic around the world, England at the center, colonies as the testing grounds. One island writes the rules. 1,000 miles away, people live the consequences. You feel that tug? Start with the engine of fear, the so-called bloody code. For a long stretch, England stacked the death penalty onto hundreds of crimes. We're not kidding. Thefts that look petty today, like stealing a sheep or cutting down a tree, could end at a noose tomorrow. This wasn't random, it was a deliberate philosophy. As cities grew and property became concentrated, the ruling class, lacking a modern police force, decided that the only way to maintain order was through overwhelming terror. The logic was, make an example, keep the peace. Reformers pushed back lawyers, preachers, politicians, and utilitarian thinkers like Jeremy Bentham argued the law should serve the greatest good, not just the biggest spectacle. This reform wave does help later, but the part you can't skip is this. While pamphlets debated ideas in drawing rooms, the streets kept filling with onlookers for the show. The law tried to control behavior with terror, turning justice into a horror play. The question is, did it control anything besides our collective tolerance for seeing people hurt? This logic of terror wasn't just theoretical, it was physically applied with brutal specialized tools. Let's climb aboard a Royal Navy ship and meet the most infamous of these, the Caddo Ninetails. Now climb aboard a Royal Navy ship or step into a penal colony yard and meet the Caddo Ninetails. This wasn't just a whip, it was a calibrated instrument of pain. 9 cords, knotted, often dipped in brine to stiffen them and add sting, meant to hurt without instantly killing. The person gets tied to a frame or grating so they can't flinch the pain off course, ensuring every single lash found its mark. And here's the ice-cold detail. A medical officer, a surgeon, stands by not to heal, but to monitor the victim's pulse, to make sure they don't die prematurely, so the punishment can continue to its full, prescribed count. The audience is your messmates, your chain gang, your future self. The wounds, which often tore the skin from the back, would be washed with salt water, and the scars would last a lifetime, a permanent signature of authority. The lesson? Fall in line. If you're standing in that rank, staring straight ahead while someone screams into wood and wind, what are you more scared of? The whip, or the part of you that won't step forward and say enough? Hold that thought. When medicine teams up with the lash, where exactly is ethics standing? This fusion of medical oversight and brutality was for internal discipline on ships and in prisons. Back in the city, the spectacle of punishment served a much more public, theatrical purpose. Back in the city, the gallows are where law and spectacle shake hands. Before executions moved indoors in the 19th century, they were massive social events. The Tyburn Fair in London drew tens of thousands. The day had a script, the slow procession from Newgate Prison, the stops at pubs along the way, the final words from the scaffold, the crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder like it's fair day. Early hangings were crude strangulation, a slow, agonizing suffocation. Later, the long drop was engineered, calculating the victim's weight to ensure the fall snapped the neck quickly. Humaner, they claimed, if you can call swapping the mechanism of death humane. Writers like Charles Dickens, who watched these scenes, said the crowd didn't grow kinder. It grew numb, rowdy, sometimes almost celebratory. With pickpockets working, the very crowd gathered to watch a pickpocket hang. And then the plot twist. Some condemned men and women, like the dashing highwayman Jack Shepherd, caught the public's imagination. They became folk heroes right at the scaffold. Their defiant last words cheered. The state wanted obedience. The crowd left with legends. If justice needs an audience, what happens when the audience steals the show? Hanging was the ultimate public removal, but the empire had another, quieter way to make someone disappear, one that traded the spectacle for sheer, vast distance and built an entire continent. Out on the water, another punishment sails under a pretty name: transportation. You're sentenced. You vanish from your street, held in rotting prison ships called hulks, and then appear months later on the other side of the world: Australia, Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, or earlier, the American colonies. The voyage itself was a sentence: cramped, dark holds, rampant disease like typhus and scurvy, and guards who thought pain was a shortcut to order. The first fleet to Australia in 1787 is the most famous example of this mass exile. When you do step onto land, you're assigned to labor. You didn't choose building roads, felling trees, working on farms, or as domestic servants for free settlers. It's elegant in the cruelest way. Your community forgets your face. The empire gets free infrastructure. Your body becomes a line item in a colonial budget. Eventually, you might earn a ticket of leave, but you were never truly home. At home, executions eventually moved behind prison walls. Abroad, the punishment just kept walking. Transportation was a slow, public erasure. But back in the earlier Tudor period, the state also perfected punishments that were intensely private, hidden, and designed for maximum psychological terror in the darkest corners of the Tower. Let's slide back to those Tudor rooms in the Tower of London, where the air is thick with incense and fear. There's a device nicknamed the Scavenger's Daughter, an A-frame of iron that forces a person into a tight, crushing curl. It's the evil twin of the rack. The rack tears you outward, pulling limbs from sockets. This device collapses you inward, compressing the body until the ribs crack, and blood is forced from the nose and ears. It was used on people the state really wanted quiet, especially political or religious enemies, like Catholic priests or alleged traitors. This wasn't a crowd pleaser. It was private, used in a dark cell. That's a different, more insidious kind of terror. No audience, no noise, just the sense that your pain can be hidden, denied, erased, and no one will ever know. Which unsettles you more, the cruelty that craves applause or the cruelty that hides behind a locked door? This was the terror of the hidden room. But for the ultimate crime, treason, the state brought its cruelty back out into the light for the most horrifying performance of all. And then there's treason's favorite horror show, drawing and quartering. This was reserved specifically for the crime of high treason. Imagine being tied to a horse and dragged drawn through the filthy town streets. Then you are hanged but cut down while still alive. You are then disemboweled and your organs burned before your own eyes. Finally, you are beheaded and your body is chopped into 4 pieces, quartered. That's not a punishment. That's a billboard. These parts were then parboiled in salt and displayed on spikes at prominent places like London Bridge or city gates, so your body becomes a map of what not to do. Eventually, the public appetite for this level of gore thinned, governments rethought the barbarity, and that particular performance was retired, though it remained law until 1870. But the message it carried, defy the crown, and we'll write our answer on your skin, hangs around long after the knives go back in their cases. This was the ultimate punishment for defying the state, but the state's power was also enforced internally, especially within the military, where defiance was met with a different, colder kind of ritual. Switch scenes, a parade ground, rifles at the ready. Execution by firing squad sits inside military logic. Desertion, mutiny, cowardice. The court-martial stamps its seal, and a squad of your own soldiers is ordered to take one of their own. Blindfold, a tied chair or a post. Rifles loaded with 1 or more blanks, so no single shooter knows for sure if they fired the killing shot. It's meant to share the burden, but really it just spreads the trauma. In wartime, especially that first industrial nightmare of a world war, some men were broken by more than fear non-stop shell bursts, sleepless weeks, minds completely overrun by what we now call PTSD, but they called shell shock. The military code read discipline and failure of moral fiber. Decades later, psychologists read injury. The law kept marching. The heart kept breaking. Here's the knot. Can a system built on total obedience ever recognize a wound you can't see? This was the price of disobeying an order. But the old legal system had an even stranger, more brutal punishment for someone who simply refused to speak at all. And there's a punishment with a name that sounds like a dare: peine forte et due, pressing to death. This was a legal procedure, not technically an execution, used when someone refused to plead guilty or not guilty to a felony. The body lies down, a board comes down, and heavy stones get added, day after day, until your ribs beg for air they can't have. Why would anyone choose this? Because in Old English law, if you refused to plead, you couldn't be tried, and if you weren't convicted, your property couldn't be seized by the state. People chose this slow, agonizing death to protect their families from the fallout of a guilty plea. One woman in York, Margaret Clitheroe, took that silence all the way to the end in 1586 so the law couldn't swallow her house and disinherit her children along with her life. I'm not asking you to agree with her. I'm asking you to feel the calculation. If you're willing to be crushed for quiet, how loud was the system pressing you already? So, faced with all this brutality, did things ever get better? The system did change, but perhaps not for the reasons we'd hope. So, did things get better? In some ways, yes. Public executions moved indoors and then out of the picture entirely. The list of capital crimes shrank from over 200 to just a handful. Transportation ebbed as the colonies began to refuse. Whippings fell out of favor. The rhetoric softened from terror to reform, with new ideas about rehabilitation and prisons. But let's be adults about this. Moving the gallows behind a wall doesn't fix the mindset that loved the crowd. It just changes the lighting. The deeper pattern is the same across centuries and seas, governments using pain and spectacle to teach lessons, then calling it order. When those lessons backfired, when the crowd turned the condemned into icons, the state didn't rethink violence, it rethought visibility. This change in visibility created a split. The logic of punishment in London became different from the logic of punishment in the colonies, even if the root was the same. Zoom back out to the empire. In London, law becomes lecture and pamphlet debates. Across oceans, law becomes forced labor. On ships and in stockades, the whip says, "Remember." In city squares and courtyards, the rope says, "Watch." In quiet rooms in the tower, the iron says, "Don't you dare speak." On firing lines in France, command says, "Obey." And between all those scenes is the same nervous question, the question that powered the whole system. Will fear hold the world together, or will it just teach us all how to look away? The entire apparatus was built on the gamble that the spectacle of one person's suffering would guarantee the obedience of 1,000 others. This brings us to the final, sobering conclusion. Progress is real, but the architecture of fear is incredibly durable. Here's where I land. Progress is real. Fewer nooses, fewer lashes, fewer show trials, but progress that only changes the costume isn't the finale. If justice needs an audience, it's not justice, it's marketing. If punishment's first language is fear, it's not order, it's panic with a badge. The past isn't just a museum of bad ideas we've outgrown. It's a mirror. Ask yourself, which part shook you most? The doctor standing by the whip, the crowd cheering a strangled life, the ship that sailed people into silence, the blank in a rifle that didn't erase the guilt, or the stones stacking on a chest while the law called it procedure? Drop one detail that stuck with you, and one question you want me to dig into next. Maybe the psychology of crowds at public executions, or how transportation built whole cities, or how armies today think about trauma and discipline. If this changed how you think about law and order, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. Share this with a friend who loves history and hates euphemisms. Let's keep pulling the mask off the past patiently, honestly, and without flinching.